Imagine waking up one day and realizing that silence has become your only companion. The phone no longer buzzes. The laughter that once filled your days has vanished, and even your shadow feels like a stranger. You walk through crowded streets, but every conversation sounds distant, like echoes from a world you no longer belong to. And somewhere deep inside, a voice whispers, "Maybe this is how it's supposed to be." We are told that connection is life, that belonging is the essence of being human. Yet, every figure who has truly altered the course of history, every visionary, every philosopher, every conqueror, has walked through long corridors of solitude. They have all known the weight of silence, the ache of being misunderstood, the exile that comes when you see what others refuse to. From Machiavelli exiled from Florence, writing The Prince in isolation, to Nietzsche collapsing beneath the unbearable solitude of his own genius, greatness seems forever married to loneliness. But why? Why does the path of creation, of vision, of mastery, always demand separation from the herd? Why must one stand alone to see clearly? There's something deeply unsettling about this paradox, that the more you awaken, the fewer people you find who understand you. The more you see truth, the more lies surround you. The higher you rise, the colder the air becomes. Society celebrates connection, friendship, teamwork, community. But beneath that celebration lies an unspoken law. Those who think too deeply will be cast out. The world worships the collective, but history is written by the solitary. And maybe, just maybe, loneliness isn't a curse. It's the price of clarity. Machiavelli once wrote, "It is better to be feared than loved, if you cannot be both." Saranti tontuetiu. But beneath that statement hides a truth most people miss. It is better to be alone and see the world as it is than to be surrounded by comfort and remain blind. Loneliness sharpens perception. It strips away illusion. It confronts you with the raw essence of who you are when no one is watching. But few can bear that confrontation, because when you're alone, truly alone, you can no longer hide behind noise. There is no validation to drown your doubts, no applause to confirm your worth. You stand before the mirror of existence, and every flaw, every fear, every fragment of your soul stares back at you. Most flee from that mirror. The few who don't, those who stand and face it, are the ones the world calls great. What if loneliness isn't an accident, but a test? What if the universe, in its strange design, isolates those destined to see beyond it, forcing them to grow strong enough to walk without approval, to think without echo, to live without permission? Maybe loneliness isn't absence, but refinement. Maybe it's not that great men seek solitude, but that solitude seeks great men. Because silence has a language of its own, a brutal, honest dialect that speaks only to those willing to listen. And if you can endure it long enough, something extraordinary begins to happen. You stop craving the noise and start hearing the truth beneath it. The truth that connection is often conformity, that love, when sought from the world, often chains more than it frees, that only in solitude does a man truly meet himself. And so the question emerges, one that burns quietly in the hearts of those who dare to think, is loneliness the punishment of the wise, or the path to their liberation? Loneliness, in its essence, is not a social condition. It is a psychological rebellion, a silent resistance against the seductive gravity of the collective mind. It is not that great men choose to walk alone out of arrogance or misanthropy. They walk alone because they have seen the hidden cost of belonging. Every society, no matter how advanced, thrives on a quiet tyranny, the demand for conformity. It whispers to you from childhood, shaping your desires, your dreams, your very sense of self. You are told what is normal, what is good, what is acceptable. You learn how to fit in, not how to think. You learn how to be liked, not how to be free. Machiavelli understood this deeply. Exiled from Florence, stripped of power, abandoned by the very people he once served, he came face to face with humanity's most unsettling truth. People do not love truth. They love comfort. And truth, raw, unfiltered truth, has always been the enemy of comfort. Carl Jung once wrote, "Loneliness does not come from having no people around you, but from being unable to communicate the things that seem important to you." In other words, the moment your inner world becomes richer, deeper, more complex than the world around you, you begin to drift, not by choice but by inevitability. The crowd speaks in language. The awakened speak in silence. Nietzsche called this condition the burden of the overman, the one who outgrows the values of his tribe. He warned that to create new values, one must first destroy the old. But destruction isolates. The prophet is always alone before he is believed, always condemned before he is celebrated. The collective cannot tolerate the one who sees differently. His very existence exposes their blindness. From a psychological perspective, this isolation serves a purpose. The brain, wired for safety, interprets rejection as danger. Yet, paradoxically, this very discomfort forces the evolution of consciousness. When you lose the comfort of belonging, you begin the painful work of self-definition. The mask falls. The identity built from imitation dissolves. You start to ask, who am I when no one is watching? Who am I when I no longer need to be understood? And that is where the paradox deepens. Because the more authentic you become, the lonelier you feel. And yet, the more powerful you grow. You begin to realize that loneliness isn't emptiness. It's space. Space to think. Space to see. Space to rebuild your soul from the ground up. Arthur Schopenhauer once said, "A man can be himself only so long as he is alone. If he does not love solitude, he will not love freedom." To him, solitude was not the absence of company, but the presence of clarity. The herd moves by instinct. The individual moves by insight. And insight demands silence, but our modern world fears silence more than death. It drowns itself in distraction, endless noise, screens, and opinions, because in the stillness, the truth waits. And the truth is unbearable for most, that you are not who you think you are, and that the crowd you follow is not leading anywhere real. The great men, the Machiavellis, the Nietzsches, the mystics and thinkers, are not immune to pain. They suffer more deeply than anyone. But in their suffering, they see further. Loneliness is the crucible where perception is purified. It strips life to its essence, burning away illusion until only truth remains. And once you have tasted that truth, you can never go back. But what happens next? What are the consequences of seeing the world as it really is, when everyone else still sleeps in their illusions? That is where the danger and the transformation truly begins. Once a man begins to see through illusion, something irreversible occurs. The veil that once protected him from the chaos of truth is torn, and what remains is a raw, unfiltered awareness. But this awakening, though liberating, comes with a price. The great paradox of enlightenment is that it isolates before it empowers. You start to notice it slowly. The conversations that once entertained you now feel hollow. The laughter of the crowd sounds rehearsed. You sit in rooms full of people and feel like a ghost, observing a ritual that no longer makes sense. Every gesture, every word, feels like a performance for validation. a desperate attempt to escape the terror of being alone. And as you watch this play unfold, you realize most people aren't living. They're pretending. The first consequence of loneliness is alienation, not from the world, but from illusion itself. You can no longer participate in the false narratives that once sustained you. The small talk, the social games, the pursuit of empty success. You begin to crave authenticity, but authenticity rarely exists where conformity reigns. This is where most turn back. The silence becomes too heavy. They trade awareness for acceptance, vision for belonging. But those who persist through the void begin to notice something profound. Loneliness, when endured, transforms into perception. From a psychological standpoint, this transformation can be explained through cognitive dissonance and ego dissolution. When your beliefs no longer align with your environment, your brain experiences conflict. The ego, desperate to maintain its identity, tries to pull you back to familiar patterns. But when you resist, when you allow the dissonance to stretch you instead of shrinking you, your consciousness expands. You begin to perceive reality without the filters of societal conditioning. This is the moment of danger, because seeing the truth means seeing the emptiness beneath much of what humanity calls meaning. You start to understand Machiavelli's dark realism, that people are not driven by virtue, but by necessity, not by love, but by fear. And in that realization, something inside you fractures. You see the machinery of human behavior, the manipulation, the self-deception, the pursuit of power dressed as morality, and you wonder if humanity even wants to be free. Nietzsche called this the abyss. To look too long into it is to risk despair, even madness, because once you understand how deep the conditioning goes, how much of your own mind was shaped by forces you never chose, you begin to feel the weight of existential loneliness. Not just isolation from people, but from reality itself. And yet, there is a hidden beauty in this awareness, because from the ruins of illusion, something sacred begins to rise. The recognition of truth as freedom. You start to realize that loneliness is not the absence of connection, but the purification of it. What remains, after all the noise fades, is something real, something uncorrupted by performance. But the world does not welcome those who see too clearly. History is filled with examples. Socrates condemned for questioning false gods. Jesus abandoned by those he sought to awaken. Machiavelli exiled for telling rulers what they did not want to hear. The truth-teller is always cast out before he is revered. And so, the man who walks alone carries both a burden and a blessing. He becomes invisible to the masses, but in that invisibility, he attains power. Power not over others, but over himself. The solitude that once felt like a prison transforms into a fortress. Yet, this transformation does not come gently. It demands surrender. It requires you to die to the world before you can truly live within it. Which leads us to the rebellion. The point at which a man no longer endures loneliness as punishment, but wields it as a weapon of liberation. At some point, silence stops feeling like exile and starts feeling like choice. That's when the rebellion begins. To break free from the prison of loneliness, you must first understand that it was never a prison at all. It was preparation. Every moment of isolation, every night of aching solitude, every unanswered question, it was sharpening you. The world breaks the shallow man with loneliness, but it forges the deep man through it. The rebellion, then, is not against society. It is against dependence, against the inner addiction to approval, belonging, and noise. The great men of history did not escape loneliness by filling it, they transcended it. Machiavelli, stripped of his political status, wrote the prince not to regain favor, but to understand power itself. He turned isolation into insight. Nietzsche, abandoned by friends and ridiculed by his peers, wrote, "Thus spoke Zarathustra," as a declaration of spiritual defiance, a testament that solitude could birth a new kind of strength. The rebellion begins when you stop seeking validation and start seeking truth. When you realize that solitude isn't a void to escape, but a landscape to explore. It is in this exploration that you uncover your truest self, the self that exists before titles, opinions, or praise. But breaking free requires courage, because the first step is radical honesty. You must ask yourself, what have I been doing just to be accepted? What have I silenced within me to be loved? What truth have I betrayed to belong? You will discover that much of your suffering was never caused by loneliness itself, but by resistance to it, by your fear of being without the crowd's warmth. But once you stop running, loneliness becomes your teacher. It shows you what no one else can, that the mind, when left alone, is both a battlefield and a kingdom. From a psychological perspective, this shift mirrors self-actualization. Abraham Maslow described it as the highest stage of human development, a point where a person no longer seeks approval, but alignment with their own potential. The lonely man, once he accepts solitude, begins to operate from this level. He is no longer reactive to the world's judgment because his compass points inward, not outward. Machiavelli would call this virtù, a term often misunderstood. It is not virtue in the moral sense, but inner mastery, the ability to shape one's destiny amidst chaos. The one who possesses virtù doesn't beg for favorable circumstances. He bends circumstance to his will, and such strength can only be cultivated in solitude, because only in silence can you learn how to command yourself. Philosophically, this rebellion mirrors the existentialists, Sartre, Kierkegaard, Frankl, who saw freedom as the ultimate human responsibility. To be truly free means to bear the weight of existence without leaning on illusion. It means choosing meaning over comfort, purpose over popularity. And here's the irony. When you stop seeking to escape loneliness, it begins to dissolve. You realize that what you called loneliness was simply the absence of false connection. Real connection, connection born of authenticity and depth, cannot exist until you've faced solitude and survived it. Only those who have stood alone can truly stand with others. The rebellion, then, is not loud. It is quiet. It is the decision to no longer beg the world for permission to exist. It is the quiet act of creation in the dark, the artist painting unseen, the thinker writing unread, the dreamer building unacknowledged, all of them rebels, all of them free. You stop needing to be understood. You stop explaining. You begin creating, and through creation, something extraordinary happens. Loneliness transforms into power. The same silence that once haunted you becomes the fire that sustains you. You realize you were never alone. You were simply becoming who you were meant to be before the world told you otherwise. But this realization is only the beginning, because beyond rebellion lies something deeper, something final, a truth so profound it dissolves even the concept of loneliness itself. That is where the journey ends, and where the awakening truly begins. There comes a moment, after the silence, the pain, the rebellion, when something inside you finally shifts. The loneliness that once felt like a wound becomes weightless. The noise of the world fades into irrelevance. You no longer seek, no longer strive. You simply see. This is the ultimate truth that loneliness reveals. You were never truly alone. You were only separated from the illusion of others. What you called loneliness was the process of returning to yourself, to consciousness, to the pulse of life that exists beneath identity and noise. In the stillness, you begin to feel something ancient and eternal, a connection not to people, but to existence itself. It is not belonging to society, but belonging to being. Viktor Frankl, a man who endured the unspeakable solitude of the concentration camps, discovered this truth in the darkest possible place. He wrote that man's ultimate freedom is to choose one's attitude in any given set of circumstances. In other words, even when everything is stripped away, companionship, comfort, hope, meaning still exists. It exists within. And once a man finds that inner meaning, no prison, no exile, no silence can enslave him again. This is what Machiavelli, Nietzsche, and every solitary soul eventually realized. That loneliness is not isolation, it's initiation. It is the path through which the ordinary self dies and the eternal self awakens. The crowd fears this death, but the wise embrace it, for they understand that nothing real can be destroyed. The world teaches you that connection is safety, but in truth, safety is dependency. Real freedom is the ability to stand alone, not in arrogance, but in peace. When you no longer need others to confirm your worth, you stop being a slave to their approval. You become untouchable, not because you are distant, but because you are whole. Machiavelli might call this the ultimate power. Not the power to dominate others, but the power to rule oneself. For what ruler, what emperor, what king has ever been greater than the man who commands his own soul? The man who has mastered his mind cannot be manipulated. The man who has faced solitude cannot be threatened. The man who has transcended loneliness cannot be destroyed. From a psychological perspective, this state represents integration. Jung described it as the union of the conscious and the unconscious, the moment when the fragmented self becomes whole. You no longer chase validation because the inner and outer worlds are reconciled. The shadows you once fled have become your allies. The solitude that once broke you has become your source of unshakable calm. And so the paradox completes itself. The man who walks alone is not empty. He is full. The man who is misunderstood by the world understands himself completely. The one who loses everything, external, gains the only thing that can never be lost: inner sovereignty. When you reach this stage, life itself changes texture. The same silence that once screamed now sings. You start to see beauty in what others ignore. The wind against your face, the rhythm of your own heartbeat, the quiet intelligence of existence moving through all things. You no longer need to be seen, because you see. This is the true meaning of the phrase, "Great men walk alone." It was never about isolation. It was about transformation. The path of solitude is not a punishment, but a pilgrimage. You enter it as one person and emerge as another, one who no longer seeks light, because he has become it. And so, the final realization dawns. The power of loneliness was never in the absence of others. It was in the discovery of yourself. Silence was never empty. It was full of everything you had been too distracted to feel. When you can walk alone and feel complete, the world can no longer touch you. You no longer fear loss, because nothing essential can be taken. You no longer crave company, because your very existence is communion. That is the freedom Machiavelli understood, the strength Nietzsche hinted at, the peace Frankl died defending. You are not alone. You are one. And that is the most powerful realization of all.